If you ask most Americans when the hostility between the United States and Iran began, many will say 1979. If you ask most Iranians, they will say 1953. And if you dig even deeper, you'll discover the resentment began long before either of those dates. Because the story of the US and Iran's bad blood is not from a singular explosion or attack. This is not a simple story of good versus evil. It is a deeper story of power, oil, revolution, fear, ideology, and greed. The story begins in the early 1800s. At the time, Persia, now known as Iran, was ruled by the Qajar dynasty, which governed from 1789 to 1925. Throughout the 19th century, Persia was politically weak and economically vulnerable. Two great empires, Imperial Russia to the north and Great Britain to the south, competed aggressively for influence in Persian territory in what became known as the Great Game. Russia defeated Persia in two major wars, the Russo-Persian War of 1804 to 1813 and the Russo-Persian War of 1826 to 1828. These conflicts resulted in the treaties of Gulistan, 1813, and Turkmenchay, 1828, through which Persia ceded large territories in the Caucasus to Russia. Meanwhile, Britain sought to protect its colonial interests in India by maintaining influence over southern Persia. Throughout the 19th century, Britain secured economic concessions and leveraged loans to influence Persian policy. The United States, by contrast, had no territorial ambitions in Persia during this period. It had neither colonies nor military installations in the region. American involvement began not through state power, but through private religious and educational initiatives. In 1834, American Presbyterian missionaries arrived in northwestern Persia. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions established schools and medical missions, particularly among Assyrian Christian communities near Urmia. Dr. Justin Perkins, one of the first American missionaries in the region, arrived in 1834 and played a significant role in educational and translation work. Throughout the mid to late 19th century, American missionaries founded schools that introduced modern curricula, including science, medicine, and Western languages. These institutions were not instruments of U.S. government policy, but their presence helped shape Iranian perceptions of Americans as educators rather than imperial agents. In 1873, Nasser al-Din Shah Qajar visited Europe and observed Western modernization efforts. During this era, some Persian intellectuals and reformers began looking outward for models of constitutional governance and modernization. The United States, which had emerged from its own revolution in 1776 and maintained a constitutional system, was sometimes viewed as a successful example of republican governance distinct from European monarchies. Formal diplomatic relations between Persia and the United States were established in 1856. In 1883, the United States opened a legation in Tehran. Samuel G.W. Benjamin became the first official American diplomatic representative to Persia in 1883. The perception of American neutrality deepened during the Persian Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1911. This movement sought to establish a constitution and parliamentary system, the Majlis, limiting royal authority under Mozaffar ad-Din Shah Qajar. In 1906, Persia adopted its first constitution. During this period, the Persian government sought financial reform to reduce foreign dependence. In 1911, the Majlis appointed an American financial expert, Morgan Schuster, as Treasurer General of Persia. Schuster was tasked with reorganizing tax collection and stabilizing state finances. His efforts directly challenged Russian and British financial influence. Russia issued an ultimatum demanding Schuster's dismissal. Under military pressure, the Persian government complied in December 1911. Schuster later published a book in 1912 titled The Strangling of Persia, in which he criticized Russian and British interference and described Persia's struggle for sovereignty. For many Iranians, this episode reinforced a perception that the United States had attempted to support Persian independence without seeking domination. The contrast with Russian and British coercion was stark. In the early 20th century, American educators continued to play a visible role in Iran. In 1925, the Qajar dynasty was replaced by Reza Shah Pahlavi, who founded the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah pursued modernization reforms, including infrastructure development and centralization of state authority. During this period, American educational institutions expanded. The American College of Tehran, originally founded by American missionaries in 1873, became a prominent institution. It later evolved into Alborz High School and played an influential role in modern Iranian education. The United States' global role expanded dramatically after World War I, and especially after World War II. However, prior to the Second World War, American involvement in Iran remained limited compared to Britain and Russia. In 1941, during World War II, British and Soviet forces jointly invaded Iran to secure oil supplies and supply routes to the Soviet Union. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate in September 1941 in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The United States participated in logistical operations within Iran during the war, primarily to facilitate the Persian Corridor, a supply route for Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. Unlike Britain and the Soviet Union, the United States did not maintain long-term occupation forces after the war. By 1946, Soviet forces withdrew from northern Iran following international pressure, including diplomatic efforts supported by the United States under President Harry S. Truman. This withdrawal reinforced the perception among some Iranian officials that American involvement could counterbalance Soviet pressure. Up until the early 1950s, the United States was not widely viewed in Iran as an imperial aggressor. Anti-British sentiment was far stronger due to British dominance over the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which had been established following the discovery of oil in 1908 in southwestern Iran. American oil companies were not the primary beneficiaries of early Iranian oil concessions. Britain's stake in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later BP, made London the central focus of economic grievance. The turning point in Iran's modern history did not begin with a revolution. It began with a signature. On May 28, 1901, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah Qajar granted a sweeping oil concession to a British entrepreneur named William Knox D'Arcy. The D'Arcy concession gave him exclusive rights to explore, extract, and sell petroleum across most of Persia for 60 years. In return, the Persian government would receive £20,000 in cash, £20,000 in company shares, 16% of future net profits. At the time, oil was not yet globally dominant. Coal powered most industrial economies. The Shah, facing financial strain and foreign debt, likely did not foresee the long-term strategic consequences of this agreement. D'Arcy struggled financially in the early years. Exploration was expensive and uncertain. By 1905, his project was near collapse. He secured financial backing from the Burma Oil Company, a British firm, which assumed most of the risk. Then, on May 26, 1908, oil was struck in commercial quantities at Masjed Soliman in southwestern Persia. It was the first major oil discovery in the Middle East. In April 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, was formed to manage production and distribution. D'Arcy became a major shareholder. Oil exports began in 1912 from the refinery built in Abadan, which would later become one of the largest oil refineries in the world. The timing was critical. In 1911, Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty in Britain. He made a strategic decision that changed global military power. The British Royal Navy would convert from coal to oil. Oil-powered ships were faster and more efficient. But Britain had little domestic oil. Persian oil became a strategic necessity. In 1914, just before World War I, the British government purchased a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This effectively turned Persian oil into a strategic arm of the British state. From that point forward, Persian oil was not simply a commercial venture. It was a national security asset for Britain. For Iran, however, the economic returns remained limited. The 16% royalty applied only to net profits, a figure controlled by company accounting. Iranian officials had no authority to audit APOC's books. Payments fluctuated and were often far lower than expected. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, British forces occupied parts of southern Persia to protect oil infrastructure, particularly the Abadan refinery. Though Persia had declared neutrality in the war, foreign troops operated on its soil. After the war, oil's global importance only increased. In 1925, Reza Khan overthrew the Qajar dynasty and became Reza Shah Pahlavi, establishing the Pahlavi dynasty. He pursued modernization and centralization reforms, including renegotiating foreign concessions. By the late 1920s, dissatisfaction with the Darcy concession had intensified. Iranian nationalists argued that the terms were unfair and outdated. In 1932, Reza Shah formally canceled the Darcy concession, citing insufficient revenue and lack of transparency. Britain protested aggressively, bringing the dispute before the League of Nations. The crisis resulted in a new agreement in 1933. The 1933 concession extended the company's rights for another 60 years, but modified financial terms. It guaranteed Iran a minimum annual payment and slightly increased royalty rates. However, critics later argued that the renegotiation still heavily favored the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which was renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, in 1935. That same year, Persia officially requested that foreign governments refer to the country as Iran. By the 1940s, oil had become indispensable to global industrial and military power. During World War II, 1939 to 1945, the Abadan refinery was a crucial Allied supply hub. Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Iran in August 1941 to secure oil facilities and supply routes to the Soviet Union. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Once again, foreign powers operated in Iran primarily to secure oil and strategic logistics. After the war, global oil politics shifted again. In 1947, Venezuela negotiated a 50-50 profit-sharing agreement with oil companies. This model spread to Saudi Arabia in 1950, where Aramco agreed to a similar split. Iranian leaders began demanding comparable terms from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In 1949 and 1950, negotiations between Iran and AIOC failed to produce a satisfactory agreement. Iranian nationalists argued that while the company generated massive profits, Iran received disproportionately low revenue. By 1950, AIOC reported profits exceeding £40 million annually. Iran's share remained modest relative to the company's earnings. The Abadan refinery had grown into the largest in the world, yet living conditions for many Iranian oil workers were poor. Housing segregation between British staff and Iranian laborers deepened resentment. Oil was no longer just an economic resource. It had become a symbol of foreign control, a symbol of national humiliation, a symbol of sovereignty denied. In March 1951, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. The move was championed by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who would soon become central to US-Iran tensions. But even before nationalization, oil had already changed everything. It had drawn Britain directly into Iranian domestic affairs, triggered military occupation during 2 world wars, anchored foreign strategic dependency, created deep economic grievances, elevated Iran's geopolitical importance. Before oil, Iran was a buffer state between empires. After oil, it became a strategic prize. And while the United States was not the original architect of oil exploitation in Iran, that role belonged primarily to Britain. America's growing global influence after World War II meant it would soon be drawn into the conflict surrounding control of that black gold. On September 16, 1941, Reza Shah Pahlavi abdicated the throne of Iran. The abdication did not come from internal revolution. It came from foreign pressure. On August 25, 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran during World War II in what became known as the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. Though Iran had declared neutrality, Allied powers feared that Reza Shah's perceived sympathy toward Germany and his refusal to expel German technicians posed a threat to Allied supply lines. Iran's geographic position was critical. The Persian Corridor became a vital route for transporting American Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. Facing military occupation from the north and south, Reza Shah stepped down. His son, 21-year-old Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was installed as Shah. The young monarch inherited a country under foreign occupation. British troops controlled the south. Soviet forces occupied the north. American military personnel operated logistics networks. Although the United States did not participate in the initial invasion, it soon played an expanding role in wartime coordination. In 1942, the Tripartite Treaty of Alliance between Britain, the Soviet Union, and Iran formally guaranteed Iranian sovereignty and pledged that foreign troops would withdraw within 6 months of the war's end. Mohammad Reza Shah's early reign was constrained. Unlike his father, who had ruled with centralized authority and suppressed opposition, the young Shah initially presided over a more politically open environment. Political parties emerged, newspapers flourished, parliamentary politics became more competitive. Among the most significant political developments during this period was the rise of the Tudeh Party, founded in 1941. The Tudeh Party was a Marxist political organization that gained influence among workers, intellectuals, and segments of the military. Its growth alarmed Western powers. By 1945, as World War II ended, tensions shifted from global war to the emerging Cold War. In 1946, a major crisis unfolded in northern Iran. Soviet forces, which had occupied northern provinces during the war, delayed their withdrawal beyond the agreed deadline. With Soviet backing, 2 separatist movements emerged: the Azerbaijan People's Government in Tabriz, the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad. Both declared autonomous rule with Soviet support. The Iranian government protested. The crisis became one of the first major confrontations of the Cold War. President Harry S. Truman applied diplomatic pressure on the Soviet Union, including raising the issue at the newly formed United Nations. Under international scrutiny and American pressure, Soviet forces withdrew in May 1946. By December 1946, Iranian government troops reasserted control over the separatist regions. For many Iranian officials, American diplomatic backing during the 1946 crisis reinforced the idea that the United States could serve as a counterbalance to Soviet expansionism. It marked one of the earliest instances of the U.S. actively intervening, diplomatically, in Iranian territorial stability. The Shah took note. Throughout the late 1940s, Iran became strategically important in U.S. Cold War planning. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine declared American support for nations resisting communist expansion. Though the doctrine was first applied in Greece and Turkey, Iran's geographic proximity to the Soviet Union made it a critical state in containment strategy. In 1949, Mohammad Reza Shah traveled to the United States. He met with President Truman and sought economic and military assistance. That same year, an assassination attempt was made on the Shah on February 4, 1949, during a ceremony at Tehran University. He survived. In response, the Shah declared martial law and banned the Tudeh party. The incident strengthened his argument that internal instability required stronger centralized authority. In 1950, the United States began increasing military assistance to Iran through the Mutual Defense Assistance Program. Meanwhile, domestic political tensions were rising. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company remained a source of national resentment. Oil revenues were seen as insufficient relative to company profits. Nationalist sentiment intensified within the Majlis. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh, leader of the National Front coalition, was appointed Prime Minister. Mossadegh advocated oil nationalization and limiting royal authority. At this stage, the Shah's power was still contested. The Iranian Constitution of 1906 established a constitutional monarchy. The Shah formally shared authority with the parliament and the Prime Minister. Mossadegh's growing popularity reduced the Shah's political dominance. In April 1951, the Majlis voted to nationalize the oil industry. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was expelled. Britain imposed economic sanctions and withdrew technical staff. The crisis destabilized Iran's economy. Between 1951 and 1953, oil exports collapsed. Government revenues fell sharply. Political polarization deepened between royalists, nationalists, Islamists, and leftist factions. The Shah briefly left Iran in August 1953 amid escalating tensions, fearing loss of control. He would return days later, but that moment belongs to the next chapter. Up to this point, however, Mohammad Reza Shah's early reign can be defined by several key factors. Ascension under Allied occupation in 1941. Limited early authority due to constitutional constraints. Soviet-backed separatist movements in 1946. Growing Cold War alignment with the United States. Increased U.S. military and economic assistance beginning in 1950. Rising nationalist opposition centered around oil. By the early 1950s, the Shah was no longer simply a young monarch navigating post-war reconstruction. He had become a strategic figure in U.S. Cold War policy. Iran was no longer peripheral. It bordered the Soviet Union. It possessed vast oil reserves. It faced internal communist influence. It sat at the crossroads of East and West. Washington increasingly viewed Mohammad Reza Shah as a stabilizing partner in containing Soviet expansion. At this stage, before the coup of 1953, American support for the Shah was largely strategic, rooted in Cold War calculations rather than ideological alignment. The Shah, for his part, saw the United States as essential to maintaining his throne in a volatile political landscape. The relationship was not yet defined by hostility, but it was no longer distant or symbolic. It had become strategic. And strategy, unlike friendship, carries expectations. By 1953, those expectations would collide with Iranian nationalism in a way that permanently altered the course of the relationship. In 1953, the relationship between Iran and the United States fundamentally changed. The event at the center of that shift was the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, an operation that involved British intelligence and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. For many Iranians, this was not simply a political crisis. It was foreign intervention against national sovereignty, and its memory would endure for generations. The roots of the coup trace directly to oil nationalization. On March 15, 1951, the Iranian parliament, Majlis, voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC. On April 28, 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh was appointed Prime Minister by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Mossadegh was a secular nationalist and leader of the National Front coalition. His central political demand was simple: Iran should control its own oil industry. On May 1, 1951, Mossadegh formally implemented nationalization. Britain responded aggressively. The British government withdrew its technicians from the Abadan refinery, imposed an oil embargo, froze Iranian assets, and pursued legal action at the International Court of Justice. The embargo severely reduced Iran's oil exports, collapsing government revenue. In 1952, Britain broke diplomatic relations with Iran and began exploring covert options to remove Mossadegh. However, Britain lacked the capacity to act alone. It turned to Washington. Under President Harry S. Truman, 1945 to 1953, the United States had been cautious. Truman's administration viewed Mossadegh as a nationalist rather than a communist, and initially resisted British pressure for intervention. But the geopolitical environment shifted in January 1953. President Dwight D. Eisenhower took office on January 20, 1953. The Cold War was intensifying. The Korean War was ongoing. The fear of Soviet expansion loomed large. American officials grew increasingly concerned that political instability in Iran could open the door to the Soviet-backed Tudeh Party, Iran's communist political organization, founded in 1941. Though Mossadegh himself was not a communist, U.S. intelligence feared that prolonged economic crisis might weaken his government and create conditions favorable to Soviet influence. In this climate, British and American interests aligned. The CIA operation to overthrow Mossadegh was codenamed Operation TPA-JAX, commonly known as Operation Ajax. It was approved in July 1953. The British Intelligence Service, MI6, worked in coordination with the CIA. The CIA operation was led in Tehran by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. The plan had several components: funding and organizing street protests, bribing members of parliament, influencing military officers, spreading propaganda through Iranian newspapers, encouraging the Shah to dismiss Mossadegh. On August 15, 1953, the Shah signed a royal decree, Firman, dismissing Mossadegh and appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi as Prime Minister. However, Mossadegh was alerted to the plot. The initial coup attempt failed. The Shah fled Iran on August 16th, first to Baghdad and then to Rome. For a brief moment, it appeared the operation had collapsed, but CIA officers on the ground regrouped. On August 19, 1953, pro-Shah demonstrators, some organized and funded through CIA channels, took to the streets of Tehran. Clashes broke out between royalist and pro-Mossadegh supporters. Units of the Iranian military shifted allegiance. By the afternoon of August 19, Mossadegh's residence was attacked. After hours of fighting, he surrendered the following day. General Zahedi assumed control. The Shah returned to Tehran on August 22, 1953. The coup had succeeded. Mohammad Mossadegh was arrested, tried for treason by a military tribunal, and sentenced in December 1953 to 3 years in prison. After serving his sentence, he remained under house arrest until his death in 1967. The Shah emerged politically strengthened. Though Iran formally remained a constitutional monarchy, real power increasingly consolidated around the Shah. In 1954, a new oil consortium agreement was signed. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, renamed British Petroleum, BP, in 1954, retained a 40% share. American oil companies received a combined 40% stake. The remaining shares went to Royal Dutch Shell and a French company. Iran received 50% of profits under the new arrangement, a significant improvement over previous terms, but operational control remained foreign-dominated. From Washington's perspective, Operation Ajax was a strategic success. It prevented potential Soviet influence. It stabilized a key Cold War state. It restored oil flow to Western markets. The CIA did not publicly acknowledge its role at the time. The U.S. government formally admitted involvement decades later. In 2000, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright publicly recognized American participation in the coup. In 2013, the CIA released declassified documents explicitly confirming its role. In the United States, the 1953 coup was, for many years, a relatively obscure Cold War episode. In Iran, it became foundational. For Iranian nationalists and later revolutionaries, the coup symbolized foreign interference in domestic democracy. The narrative was clear. An elected prime minister nationalized oil. Foreign powers orchestrated his removal. The Shah's authority was reinforced through external support. This interpretation became embedded in political discourse, education, and revolutionary rhetoric in the decades that followed. The memory of August 19, 1953, known in Iran as 28th Mordad, 1332 in the Persian calendar, remained politically potent. It shaped how later generations interpreted American involvement in Iranian affairs. It influenced how revolutionary leaders framed their opposition in 1979. It became a reference point whenever U.S. intentions were questioned. Operation Ajax was not the largest coup of the Cold War. It was not the bloodiest, but it was among the most consequential. Before 1953, the United States had been seen by many Iranians as a distant power, sometimes even a friend. But after 1953, the United States was no longer a friend in Iranian political memory. By the early 1960s, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi had secured his throne. The political turbulence that followed the 1953 overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh had settled in his favor. Oil revenues were flowing again under the 1954 Consortium Agreement. The United States, viewing Iran as a critical Cold War ally bordering the Soviet Union, was expanding military and economic assistance. On the surface, the monarchy appeared stable. Beneath that surface, however, pressures were building that would slowly reshape Iran's political future. In 1961, Iran entered a period of economic strain. Government deficits increased, inflation rose, and corruption allegations circulated widely. The Kennedy administration in Washington began pressing the Shah to implement structural reforms. American policymakers believed that modernization and social reform were essential to preventing leftist revolution in developing countries. The fear was that economic inequality and rigid political systems could drive populations toward communism, especially in strategically important states. The Shah responded with what he called the White Revolution. It was announced in 1963 as a broad program of economic and social reform, presented as a peaceful transformation designed to modernize Iran from above and avoid the kind of upheaval that had destabilized other nations. On January 26, 1963, a national referendum was held to approve 6 core reform measures. Official results claimed overwhelming support. The most significant reform was land redistribution. Before 1963, much of Iran's agricultural land was concentrated in the hands of large landlords. Millions of peasants worked as sharecroppers with limited rights. The White Revolution aimed to dismantle this system. Large estates were broken up, and land was redistributed to tenant farmers. Over the next decade, millions of hectares were reassigned. However, implementation was uneven. Many peasants received plots too small to sustain profitable farming. Access to credit and modern equipment was limited. Agricultural productivity did not rise as rapidly as expected. As traditional rural structures weakened, large numbers of villagers migrated to cities such as Tehran, Isfahan, and Mashhad in search of work. Urban populations expanded quickly, often without adequate housing or infrastructure. The White Revolution also extended voting rights to women in 1963. Women were allowed to participate in elections and run for office. In 1967, and again in 1975, the family protection laws expanded women's legal rights in marriage and divorce. These measures were significant within the region and aligned with the Shah's broader goal of Western-style modernization. Educational reforms were another major pillar. The Literacy Corps was created to send educated young Iranians into rural areas to teach reading and writing. Health and Development Corps followed, delivering medical services and technical assistance to underserved regions. Enrollment in universities expanded dramatically during the 1960s and 1970s. Industrial growth accelerated as oil revenues funded infrastructure projects and state development plans. Yet reform also produced backlash. Many conservative religious leaders opposed land redistribution and women's suffrage, viewing them as violations of Islamic tradition. Among the most outspoken critics was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric based in the holy city of Qom. In June 1963, during the religious observance of Ashura, Khomeini publicly condemned the Shah's reforms and accused him of subservience to foreign powers, particularly the United States and Israel. On June 5, 1963, protests erupted in several cities following Khomeini's arrest. Demonstrations spread through Tehran, Qom, and other urban centers. Security forces responded with force. Casualty figures remain disputed, but hundreds were reported killed. The unrest marked one of the first major confrontations between the monarchy and organized religious opposition. Khomeini was initially released, but continued his criticism. In October 1964, the Iranian parliament passed legislation granting diplomatic immunity to American military personnel stationed in Iran under a status of forces agreement. Khomeini denounced the law as a surrender of national sovereignty. In November 1964, he was arrested again and exiled. He was first sent to Turkey, then relocated to Najaf, Iraq, in 1965. Although physically removed from Iran, Khomeini continued to issue statements and religious rulings that circulated through clerical networks. His opposition became increasingly ideological, framing the Shah's modernization as Westernization imposed at the expense of Islamic governance. Meanwhile, the Shah strengthened internal security. The intelligence organization SAVAK, established in 1957 with assistance from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, expanded surveillance of political dissidents, universities, mosques, and political organizations were closely monitored. Arrests and reports of torture contributed to a climate of fear among opposition figures. Economically, Iran entered a period of rapid growth. Oil revenues increased dramatically after the 1973 oil crisis, when OPEC member states raised prices sharply. Government income surged. Massive development projects were launched. Military spending expanded significantly, with Iran becoming one of the largest purchasers of American arms. By the mid-1970s, Iran possessed one of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East. The Shah envisioned Iran as a regional power capable of projecting influence across the Persian Gulf. Infrastructure projects multiplied. Highways, factories, universities, and modern housing developments transformed major cities. Consumer goods became more accessible to segments of the middle class. Yet economic growth created new inequalities. Inflation rose sharply in the mid-1970s. Rapid urbanization produced crowded neighborhoods with insufficient employment opportunities. Traditional merchant classes, known as the bazaris, felt increasingly sidelined by state-controlled industrialization. Secular intellectuals criticized authoritarian governance, while religious leaders warned that cultural westernization threatened Islamic identity. In 1975, the Shah abolished Iran's multi-party system and created a single-party state under the Rastakiz party. Political participation was effectively mandatory. Independent political expression narrowed further. By the late 1970s, Iran had undergone profound transformation. Literacy rates had improved. Women had gained expanded legal rights. Industrial production had increased. Oil wealth had financed rapid modernization. But political openness had not expanded at the same pace. The White Revolution had been designed to stabilize Iran by preempting radical change. Instead, it disrupted traditional structures while consolidating centralized authority. Reform without broad political inclusion created tension. Rapid modernization without corresponding institutional flexibility left little room for dissent. Throughout this period, the Shah maintained close strategic ties with the United States. Iran remained a cornerstone of American policy in the Middle East. Military cooperation deepened. Intelligence collaboration continued. Economic partnerships expanded. For supporters, the White Revolution symbolized progress and national advancement. For critics, it symbolized authoritarianism reinforced by foreign backing. By the end of the 1970s, the structural forces unleashed during the White Revolution were still unfolding. Urban populations were larger, expectations were higher, and opposition networks, though suppressed, had not disappeared. The reforms had modernized Iran in visible ways, but they had also intensified ideological divisions that would soon erupt into something far larger than the Shah had intended. The fire was growing, even if it was not yet fully visible. By the late 1970s, the political order built by Mohammad Reza Shah was under severe strain. Years of rapid modernization, rising oil wealth, and centralized authority had transformed Iran, but they had also created economic volatility and political alienation. Inflation surged after the oil boom of 1973 to 1974. Government spending expanded aggressively. Urban migration accelerated. By 1977, economic growth slowed sharply, unemployment rose, and public frustration deepened. At the same time, political repression had narrowed legal channels for dissent. SAVAK monitored opposition figures closely. The single-party system established in 1975 under the Rastakiz party had eliminated formal political competition. Critics of the monarchy found few lawful outlets for expression. In 1977, new pressures emerged. international human rights criticism increased, particularly from the administration of U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who emphasized political liberalization in allied states. In response, the Shah permitted limited political openness. Some prisoners were released. Censorship loosened slightly. These measures, however, did not calm discontent. Instead, they created space for broader public criticism. The immediate spark came in January 1978. On January 7th, the government-controlled newspaper Etila'at published an article attacking Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had been living in exile since 1964. The article accused him of foreign ties and disloyalty. Religious students in Qom protested. Security forces opened fire. Several demonstrators were killed. According to Shia tradition, mourning ceremonies are held 40 days after a death. On February 18, 1978, new protests erupted in Tabriz during memorial gatherings for those killed in Qom. Violence spread. Government buildings were attacked. Security forces responded again with force. Casualties mounted. This pattern repeated itself throughout 1978. Every 40 days, new demonstrations commemorated previous victims. Each round of mourning produced larger crowds and broader participation. Protests spread to Yazd, Isfahan, Mashhad, and Tehran. Religious leaders, secular intellectuals, bazaar merchants, students, and workers increasingly joined the movement. During the summer of 1978, unrest intensified. In August, a fire at the Cinema Rex in Abadan killed more than 400 people. The cause of the fire remains disputed, but many protesters blamed the regime, further inflaming public anger. On September 8, 1978, the government declared martial law in Tehran. That day became known as Black Friday. Troops opened fire on demonstrators gathered in Jaleh Square. Official casualty figures were in the dozens, but opposition sources claimed far higher numbers. Regardless of the exact toll, the event marked a turning point. Compromise between the monarchy and opposition became increasingly unlikely. By autumn 1978, strikes paralyzed key sectors of the economy. Oil workers joined the movement, severely disrupting production. Government ministries shut down. Universities closed. Massive demonstrations filled Tehran's streets, with crowds numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been living in Najaf, Iraq, was expelled by the Iraqi government in October 1978 under pressure from the Shah. He relocated to Neauphle-le-Château, near Paris. From there, he communicated with supporters in Iran through recorded messages, written statements, and international media interviews. His messages called for the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of an Islamic government. As protests escalated, the Shah sought solutions. He dismissed Prime Minister Jamshid Amuzagar in August 1978 and appointed Jafar Sharif Emami, who attempted to appease religious leaders by reversing certain policies and closing casinos. These measures failed to calm unrest. In November 1978, the Shah appointed General Gholam Reza Ajari to lead a military government. By December 1978, demonstrations reached unprecedented scale. During the religious observances of Muharram, millions participated in marches across major cities. Calls for the Shah's removal were now explicit. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah left Iran. Officially described as a temporary departure, it became permanent exile. He traveled first to Egypt and then to several other countries before ultimately receiving medical treatment in the United States later that year. In his absence, Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar, appointed in late December 1978, attempted to preserve the monarchy through reform. He released political prisoners, dissolved Savak, and promised free elections. However, Bakhtiar lacked broad support. Many opposition leaders refused to recognize his authority. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran after nearly 15 years in exile. Millions gathered at Tehran's Mehrabad airport and along the streets to welcome him. His arrival marked a decisive shift. Within days, he appointed Mehdi Bazargan as head of a provisional government, challenging Bakhtiar's legitimacy. Clashes intensified between military units loyal to the monarchy and revolutionary groups. On February 9th and 10th, fighting broke out in Tehran between pro-Shah forces and armed civilians. On February 11th, 1979, the Supreme Military Council declared neutrality. The monarchy effectively collapsed. Bakhtiar went into hiding and later fled the country. The Pahlavi dynasty, which had ruled since 1925, came to an end. In April 1979, a national referendum asked Iranians whether they supported establishing an Islamic Republic. Official results reported overwhelming approval. On April 1, 1979, Iran was formally declared the Islamic Republic of Iran. Later that year, a new constitution was approved in December 1979. It established the position of supreme leader, granting Ayatollah Khomeini ultimate authority over the state. The political structure combined elected institutions with clerical oversight. The revolution of 1979 was not a single ideology movement. It included secular nationalists, Marxists, Islamists, students, workers, and religious conservatives. What unified them was opposition to the Shah's rule. After the monarchy fell, power consolidated around the clerical leadership. For the United States, the collapse of the Shah represented the loss of a key regional ally. Iran had been central to American Cold War strategy in the Middle East. Its transformation introduced uncertainty into regional security arrangements, oil markets, and geopolitical alliances. For many Iranians, however, the revolution symbolized the end of monarchical rule and foreign-backed authority. The memory of 1953, the presence of American military personnel, and decades of close U.S.-Shah cooperation shaped revolutionary narratives. By February 1979, the political landscape of Iran had changed entirely. The monarchy was gone. A new ideological system was emerging. The relationship between Iran and the United States was entering a phase that would soon become openly confrontational. The revolution had erupted, and with it, the structure of Iranian governance and its alignment with global powers had been fundamentally transformed. When the Islamic Revolution triumphed in February 1979, Iran was politically transformed but strategically vulnerable. The monarchy had collapsed. Much of the senior military leadership tied to the Shah had been purged, imprisoned, or executed. Revolutionary committees and the newly formed Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, established in May 1979, were still consolidating power. The regular army was weakened by defections and distrust. Iran's economy was disrupted, and its foreign relations were strained. In neighboring Iraq, President Saddam Hussein watched closely. Saddam had formally become president of Iraq on July 16, 1979, after forcing Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr to resign. Iraq was governed by the Ba'ath Party, a secular Arab nationalist regime. Saddam viewed the Iranian Revolution with deep concern. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's call for Islamic governance and opposition to secular Arab leadership posed an ideological threat to Iraq's Shia majority population. Tensions between the two countries were not new. The Shatt al-Arab waterway, a crucial channel for oil exports, had long been disputed. In 1975, Iraq and Iran signed the Algiers Agreement, settling border disagreements in exchange for Iran ending support for Kurdish insurgents in northern Iraq. After the revolution, Saddam sought to reverse that agreement. On September 17, 1980, Saddam Hussein formally abrogated the 1975 Algiers Agreement. 5 days later, on September 22, 1980, Iraqi forces launched a full-scale invasion of Iran. Iraqi aircraft struck Iranian air bases in an attempt to cripple the Iranian Air Force. Ground forces crossed the border along a broad front, targeting the oil-rich province of Khuzestan. Saddam expected a quick victory. He calculated that Iran's military disarray and political chaos would prevent effective resistance. He also believed that Arab populations in southwestern Iran might rise against the new Islamic government. The invasion did not unfold as planned. Though initially surprised, Iranian forces regrouped. Despite internal divisions, the revolutionary leadership framed the war as a defense of national sovereignty and Islam. Volunteers mobilized rapidly. The Basij, a paramilitary force composed largely of young volunteers, was formed in late 1980 to support the war effort. By early 1981, Iraqi advances had stalled. Iranian counteroffensives began to reclaim lost territory. In 1982, Iranian forces recaptured the city of Khorramshahr, which had fallen early in the war after intense fighting. The liberation of Khorramshahr in May 1982 became a major symbolic victory for Iran. At that point, Iran faced a strategic decision. It could have sought a negotiated settlement after expelling Iraqi forces from most of its territory. Instead, Iran's leadership chose to continue the war into Iraqi territory, seeking to topple Saddam Hussein's regime. The conflict entered a prolonged and devastating phase. From 1982 onward, the war became one of attrition. Large-scale infantry assaults, trench warfare, and human wave attacks characterized many battles. Casualties mounted on both sides. Estimates of total deaths range widely, but combined fatalities are generally believed to have reached several hundred thousand, with some estimates approaching 1 million when including wounded and missing. Iraq employed chemical weapons extensively against Iranian troops and, in some instances, against Kurdish civilians within Iraq. Mustard gas and nerve agents were used in multiple engagements beginning in 1983. International condemnation was limited and often muted due to broader geopolitical calculations. The war increasingly drew in external powers. The United States, still deeply hostile toward Iran following the 1979 to 1981 hostage crisis, viewed the Islamic Republic as destabilizing. While officially neutral, Washington gradually tilted toward Iraq. The U.S. removed Iraq from its list of state sponsors of terrorism in 1982 and resumed limited diplomatic contact. Intelligence sharing reportedly occurred, particularly concerning Iranian troop movements. At the same time, the conflict expanded into the Persian Gulf in what became known as the Tanker War. Beginning in 1984, both Iran and Iraq attacked oil tankers and commercial shipping linked to the other side. The goal was to damage economic lifelines. Kuwait, which supported Iraq financially, requested protection for its tankers. In 1987, the United States initiated Operation Earnest Will, reflagging Kuwaiti tankers under the American flag and escorting them with U.S. Navy vessels through the Gulf. Naval confrontations followed. In April 1988, after the U.S. frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine, the United States launched Operation Praying Mantis. American forces destroyed several Iranian naval vessels and offshore platforms in a single day of fighting. The most tragic moment of U.S.-Iran direct confrontation occurred on July 3, 1988. The USS Vincennes, operating in the Persian Gulf, fired 2 missiles at Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian Airbus A300 en route from Bandar Abbas to Dubai. All 290 people on board were killed. The U.S. government stated that the crew mistakenly identified the aircraft as an Iranian F-14 fighter jet during a tense engagement. Iran condemned the attack as deliberate. The incident deepened hostility and became a lasting grievance in Iranian memory. By 1988, both Iran and Iraq were exhausted. Iran faced severe economic strain, heavy casualties, and declining morale. Iraq, despite receiving financial backing from Gulf states and military supplies from various countries, had also suffered extensive losses. On July 18, 1988, Iran accepted United Nations Security Council Resolution 598, which called for a ceasefire and negotiations. Ayatollah Khomeini later described the decision as drinking a chalice of poison, reflecting the regime's reluctance but recognition of necessity. The ceasefire formally took effect on August 20, 1988. The war had lasted 8 years. It had devastated infrastructure, drained economic resources, and reshaped regional politics. Borders remained essentially unchanged. For Iran, the war became foundational to the identity of the Islamic Republic. It was remembered as the sacred defense, a struggle against foreign aggression. The conflict strengthened the Revolutionary Guard and entrenched a security-focused political culture. It reinforced suspicion toward both Western and regional powers, particularly given international tolerance of Iraq's chemical weapon use. For the United States, the war cemented the view of Iran as a hostile actor willing to challenge American interests in the Gulf. Direct naval clashes and the airliner tragedy intensified mistrust. When revolution met war, the Islamic Republic was tested under extreme pressure. Instead of collapsing, it consolidated. Military institutions loyal to the revolution expanded. Political authority centralized further around clerical leadership. The war ended without territorial change, but it transformed both states' perceptions of each other. Iran emerged isolated but hardened. The United States emerged more deeply entangled in Gulf security. The revolution had survived its first existential threat, and the memory of those 8 years would shape Iran's strategic thinking and its relationship with the United States for decades to come. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War was still shaping U.S. foreign policy. The United States had framed its global strategy around containing communism, and political turmoil in Central America and the Middle East offered new battlegrounds far from the traditional front lines of Europe. In Nicaragua, the left-wing Sandinista government that came to power in 1979 alarmed the Reagan administration, which saw the Sandinistas as aligned with Soviet and Cuban interests. Washington had been providing covert support to the anti-Sandinista rebels known as the Contras since the early 1980s. But in 1982, Congress passed a series of Boland amendments to restrict and eventually prohibit direct U.S. funding and military assistance to the Contras. As a result, the administration began searching for alternative, secret means to sustain the rebel campaign without explicit congressional approval. Simultaneously, Iran was embroiled in the brutal Iran-Iraq War. Officially, the United States maintained an arms embargo on Iran, a policy that had been in place since the 1979 hostage crisis, and repeatedly pressured other nations not to sell weapons or spare parts to Tehran. But by 1985, elements within the Reagan administration began to argue that the embargo was counterproductive. Iran still obtained arms through other sources, and refusing to engage with Tehran entirely risked pushing the country closer to the Soviet sphere. U.S. policymakers also believed that selling limited supplies to Iran might help secure the release of American hostages held by Iranian-linked militant groups in Lebanon. Against this backdrop, a secret network of arms sales and covert financial operations took shape. The administration used intermediaries, most notably Israel and a private front corporation known as the Enterprise, to funnel U.S. weapons and munitions to Iran. The aim was to transfer equipment such as TOW anti-tank missiles and spare parts for surface-to-air systems, with the expectation that Tehran would use its leverage with allied factions in Lebanon to secure the release of hostages. The scheme violated multiple public policies. At the time, U.S. law prohibited arms sales to Iran, and the Boland Amendments expressly barred direct or indirect funding of the Contras. Yet, under President Ronald Reagan, senior officials in the National Security Council, including National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, his successor, Vice Admiral John Poindexter, and Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, pursued the operation in secret. They reasoned that if profits could be generated from the arms sales, those funds might be diverted to support the Contras, thereby circumventing congressional restrictions. The convoluted arrangement involved U.S. weapons being sold to the Enterprise or through Israeli channels, then resold to Iran at inflated prices. The funds received from Iran were then diverted into secret accounts. In November 1985, the first of these diverted funds were used to purchase supplies for the Contra rebels, effectively linking the two covert operations in a way that crossed legal and constitutional boundaries. The combined arms for hostages and funding to Contras network operated without notifying Congress or the American public. Key documents were forged or withheld, and efforts were made to conceal the scale and intent of the operation from other departments within the U.S. government, including the State Department. In late 1986, the story broke. Revelations in U.S. media and subsequent congressional investigations stunned Washington. The scandal became one of the most serious political controversies in the United States since the Watergate era, prompting multiple inquiries, including by the bipartisan Tower Commission and a special counsel led by Lawrence E. Walsh. Public hearings in 1987 featured dramatic testimony from Oliver North and other officials. Lawmakers and the American public learned that the U.S. government had simultaneously sold arms to a nation it publicly condemned as hostile while secretly funding rebels in Nicaragua, breaching both domestic law and declared foreign policy. Several administration officials were indicted, and some were convicted on charges ranging from obstruction of Congress to destroying documents. However, many convictions were later overturned on appeal or resulted in pardons. The Iran-Contra affair illustrated the dangers inherent when covert operations override legislative authority and public transparency. It exposed deep contradictions within U.S. foreign policy, advocating non-negotiation with hostile actors on one hand, while engaging them clandestinely on the other, and asserting support for democracy abroad while circumventing the rule of law at home. For Iran, even though the arms sales represented only a short chapter in the long arc of U.S.-Iran hostility, the revelation that Washington dealt weapons to Tehran, even covertly, added a layer of complication to its perception of American intentions. For the United States, the scandal raised fundamental questions about executive power, congressional oversight, and the ethical limits of foreign policy in the closing decades of the Cold War. On the morning of July 3, 1988, the Persian Gulf was already tense. The Iran-Iraq War was in its 8th year. Oil tankers had been attacked. Naval mines had damaged ships. The United States Navy was operating in the Gulf under Operation Earnest Will, escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers to protect them from Iranian attacks. American warships and Iranian patrol boats had confronted each other repeatedly in the preceding months. Only weeks earlier, on April 18, 1988, U.S. forces had launched Operation Praying Mantis, destroying several Iranian naval vessels after the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine. By early July, the atmosphere in the Gulf was defined by suspicion and split-second military calculations. The USS Vincennes, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser equipped with the advanced Aegis combat system, was deployed in the region. On July 3rd, it was operating near the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most strategically vital waterways. The ship was under the command of Captain Will C. Rogers III. Earlier that morning, U.S. naval forces had engaged in a skirmish with Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval units. Iranian gunboats had reportedly approached merchant vessels, and American helicopters were monitoring the situation. The Vincennes maneuvered aggressively, at one point entering Iranian territorial waters while pursuing the gunboats. At 10:17 a.m. local time, Iran Air Flight 655 took off from Bandar Abbas International Airport. The aircraft was an Airbus A300B2, operating a scheduled commercial flight to Dubai. On board were 290 people, including 66 children. The flight path was routine, and the plane was climbing along a commercial air corridor recognized by international aviation authorities. Shortly after takeoff, the Vincennes radar systems detected an aircraft departing Bandar Abbas. The Aegis system tracked it automatically. Tensions on board were high. Bandar Abbas also hosted Iranian military aircraft, including F-14 Tomcats acquired before the 1979 revolution. U.S. naval personnel interpreted the radar data as indicating a possible hostile aircraft descending toward the ship. Confusion emerged over altitude readings. The Vincennes crew believed the aircraft was descending in an attack profile, although later investigations determined the Airbus was climbing steadily on its assigned commercial route. Attempts were made to contact the aircraft via military and civilian radio frequencies. U.S. officials later stated that warnings were broadcast, but the Airbus crew did not respond. Investigations would later reveal that the warnings were transmitted on frequencies and identification formats unlikely to be recognized by a civilian airliner operating under standard procedures. At 10:24 a.m., Captain Rogers authorized the launch of 2 SM-2 surface-to-air missiles. Moments later, the missiles struck the aircraft. Iran Air Flight 655 disintegrated in the sky over the Persian Gulf. Wreckage and bodies fell into the water below. All 290 passengers and crew were killed. News of the incident spread rapidly. The Iranian government condemned the attack as a deliberate act of aggression. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini described it as a crime. In Iran, the event became known as a massacre of civilians. Public mourning was intense. Images of debris and recovered bodies circulated widely. The United States government expressed regret, but maintained that the downing was a tragic mistake. The Pentagon stated that the Vincennes crew believed they were under threat from an Iranian F-14 fighter. Defense officials emphasized the tense combat environment and argued that the decision had been made in self-defense. On July 4, 1988, President Ronald Reagan publicly defended the crew, stating that the action had been taken appropriately under the circumstances. An investigation conducted by the U.S. Department of Defense concluded that the crew had misidentified the aircraft and misinterpreted radar data. The report cited human error under combat stress, but did not find criminal misconduct. The Vincennes crew later received awards for service during the deployment, though not specifically for the incident itself. International reaction was critical. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, conducted its own review. Questions were raised about why the Vincennes had entered Iranian territorial waters, why the Aegis system's altitude data had been misread, and why the aircraft was identified as hostile despite transmitting a civilian transponder signal. In 1989, Iran filed a case against the United States at the International Court of Justice. In 1996, the two countries reached a settlement. The United States agreed to pay $61.8 million in compensation to the families of the victims, approximately $213,000 per wage-earning victim and $131,000 per non-wage-earning victim. The U.S. did not formally admit legal liability, but described the payment as an ex gratia settlement. For Iran, the event became a defining symbol of American hostility. It reinforced narratives that the United States was willing to use overwhelming force, even at the cost of civilian lives. The image of the falling Airbus entered Iranian political memory, commemorated annually. The incident occurred only weeks before the Iran-Iraq War ended. On July 18, 1988, Iran accepted United Nations Security Council Resolution 598, agreeing to a ceasefire. Some analysts have argued that the downing of Flight 655 contributed to Iran's decision by underscoring the risks of direct confrontation with the United States. In the United States, the event did not produce the same long-term emotional impact as it did in Iran. It was reported extensively at the time, but as the Cold War moved toward its final years, it receded from the center of American public consciousness. For Iranians, however, July 3, 1988 did not fade. It joined the 1953 coup and the support for Iraq during the war as part of a broader narrative of foreign intervention and injustice. The day the sky fell was not just a battlefield mistake. It was a civilian tragedy embedded in a larger conflict defined by mistrust, escalation, and miscalculation. When the missiles struck Iran Air Flight 655, they did more than destroy an aircraft. They deepened a wound in a relationship already scarred by revolution and war, and that wound would remain visible in the decades that followed. When the Iran-Iraq War ended in August 1988, Iran emerged battered but intact. Its infrastructure was damaged, its economy strained, and hundreds of thousands of families were grieving. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini died on June 3, 1989, and was succeeded as supreme leader by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. A new president, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, took office in August 1989 with a mandate focused on reconstruction and economic recovery. The 1990s began not with open warfare between Iran and the United States, but with distance. Diplomatic relations between the two countries had been severed since April 7, 1980, following the hostage crisis. There were no embassies, no formal dialogue. Communication occurred indirectly through intermediaries such as Switzerland, which represented U.S. interests in Tehran. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. For the first time in decades, Iran no longer bordered a superpower adversary of the United States. Yet instead of easing tensions, the post-Cold War environment introduced a new dynamic. In January 1991, the United States led a coalition to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait during the Gulf War. Iran remained officially neutral in that conflict. It condemned Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, but did not join the US-led coalition. While the war weakened Saddam Hussein, Iran's longtime enemy, it also resulted in a large American military presence in the Persian Gulf, including bases in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. From Tehran's perspective, U.S. forces were now positioned closer to its borders than ever before. In Washington, attention shifted toward Iran's regional behavior. Throughout the early 1990s, the United States accused Iran of supporting militant groups, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Palestinian factions opposed to Israel. The 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires and the 1994 bombing of the Amaya Jewish Community Center in Argentina were attributed by Argentine investigators to Hezbollah operatives with alleged Iranian backing, though Iran denied involvement. In 1993, the administration of President Bill Clinton adopted what became known as a policy of dual containment, aimed at simultaneously isolating both Iraq and Iran. The strategy sought to prevent either state from dominating the Persian Gulf. Sanctions became the central tool. In March 1995, President Clinton issued Executive Order 12,957, prohibiting U.S. participation in Iran's petroleum development. In May 1995, Executive Order 12,959 expanded the embargo to ban nearly all trade and investment between the United States and Iran. These measures effectively cut off American companies from doing business in Iran's oil and gas sector, which was the backbone of the Iranian economy. The pressure intensified in 1996. That year, the U.S. Congress passed the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act, ILSA, signed into law on August 5, 1996. The act imposed penalties on foreign companies investing more than $20 million annually in Iran's energy sector. It marked a shift from unilateral sanctions to extraterritorial pressure, attempting to deter non-American firms from engaging economically with Tehran. European allies objected to the extraterritorial aspects of ILSA, arguing that it infringed on their sovereignty. Nevertheless, the law signaled Washington's commitment to sustained economic isolation of Iran. For Iran, the 1990s were a decade of constrained recovery. Rafsanjani pursued economic reconstruction and sought foreign investment, particularly from Europe and Asia. While some European companies entered into energy contracts, American firms remained barred. Sanctions limited Iran's access to international financial systems and technology transfers. At the same time, Iran faced internal political debate. Reformists and conservatives competed over the direction of the Islamic Republic. Younger generations, born around or after the revolution, were coming of age. In 1997, a significant political development occurred. Mohammad Khatami, a relatively moderate cleric, won the presidential election with nearly 70% of the vote. His campaign emphasized civil society, rule of law, and what he called a dialogue among civilizations. Khatami signaled openness toward reducing tensions with the West. In January 1998, during an interview with CNN, Khatami addressed the American people directly. He spoke of cultural exchange and mutual understanding, while still criticizing U.S. policies toward Iran. The Clinton administration responded cautiously. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright acknowledged in 2000 that the United States had played a role in the 1953 coup, calling it a setback for Iranian political development. Limited gestures followed. Restrictions on certain imports, such as Iranian carpets and pistachios, were eased in 2000. Academic and cultural exchanges expanded modestly. However, structural distrust remained. In June 1996, a bombing at the Khobar Towers housing complex in Saudi Arabia killed 19 U.S. servicemen. U.S. investigators later linked the attack to Saudi Hezbollah, alleging Iranian support. Iran denied involvement, but the accusation reinforced American skepticism toward engagement. Throughout the decade, there was no direct diplomatic breakthrough. Instead, the relationship existed in a state of managed hostility. There was no war. There were no formal negotiations. There were sanctions, accusations, and indirect communication. For many Americans, Iran receded from daily headlines during the 1990s. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Gulf War had ended quickly. Attention shifted toward the Balkans, economic globalization, and domestic politics. For Iran, however, sanctions were not abstract policy tools. They affected currency stability, trade access, and investment flows. Economic growth remained inconsistent. Inflation fluctuated. Youth unemployment became a growing concern. By the end of the decade, the relationship between the United States and Iran was defined less by dramatic confrontation and more by institutionalized mistrust. The 1990s did not produce a major military clash between the two countries. They produced something quieter: sanctions embedded in law. Diplomatic silence hardened into routine. Public rhetoric replaced formal dialogue. The hostility of the 1980s had cooled, but it had not resolved. Instead, it settled into structure. By 2000, nearly 20 years after the hostage crisis, there were still no embassies, no ambassadors, and no direct diplomatic ties. The bad blood was no longer explosive. It was enduring. And in the calm of the 1990s, the foundations were being laid for the next phase of tension, one that would emerge abruptly after September 11, 2001. On September 11, 2001, as hijacked planes struck New York and Washington, the geopolitical landscape shifted in a matter of hours. The United States declared a global war on terror. The Taliban government in Afghanistan, which had provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda, became the immediate target of American retaliation. In Tehran, the reaction was swift and, for many observers, unexpected. Senior Iranian officials condemned the attacks. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei publicly denounced the killing of civilians. Thousands of ordinary Iranians gathered in candlelight vigils in Tehran to mourn the victims. In the days that followed, Iran signaled that it was prepared to cooperate, quietly, in efforts against the Taliban. This was not entirely surprising in strategic terms. The Taliban, a Sunni fundamentalist movement, had been a bitter enemy of Iran throughout the 1990s. In 1998, Taliban forces had killed 9 Iranian diplomats and a journalist in the northern Afghan city of Mazar-e-Sharif. Iran had mobilized troops along its eastern border and nearly went to war with Afghanistan. The Taliban's anti-Shia ideology clashed directly with Iran's Shia-led Islamic Republic. When the United States prepared to invade Afghanistan in October 2001, both countries shared a common enemy. Behind the scenes, diplomatic contacts took place. Iranian officials participated in multilateral discussions in Geneva and later in Bonn, Germany, where negotiations were held to shape Afghanistan's post-Taliban political order. Iranian diplomats worked alongside American representatives to support the formation of an interim Afghan government under Hamid Karzai. According to later accounts from U.S. officials, Iranian envoys provided intelligence on Taliban positions and encouraged anti-Taliban Afghan factions to cooperate with American plans. In December 2001, during the Bonn conference, Iranian representatives reportedly played a constructive role in persuading Northern Alliance leaders to accept compromise arrangements. For a brief moment, cooperation appeared possible. The two governments did not restore diplomatic relations. Public rhetoric remained cautious. But on a tactical level, shared interests aligned in Afghanistan. That fragile alignment did not last long. On January 29, 2002, President George W. Bush delivered his State of the Union address to Congress. In the speech, he described Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as an axis of evil, accusing them of seeking weapons of mass destruction and supporting terrorism. The phrase landed heavily in Tehran. For Iranian reformists, including President Mohammad Khatami, who had advocated engagement and cautious dialogue with the West, the speech undercut political credibility. Hardliners pointed to the axis of evil designation as proof that the United States remained fundamentally hostile to the Islamic Republic, regardless of cooperation in Afghanistan. Within months, the limited momentum toward rapprochement stalled. In 2002, further tensions emerged over Iran's nuclear program. In August of that year, an exiled opposition group, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, revealed previously undisclosed nuclear facilities at Natanz and Arak. The disclosures raised concerns in Washington and European capitals about the scope and intent of Iran's nuclear activities. The United States accused Iran of pursuing nuclear weapons capabilities. Iranian officials insisted the program was for civilian energy purposes, citing their rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, which Iran had signed in 1968 and ratified in 1970. In March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, overthrowing Saddam Hussein. For Iran, the removal of Saddam, a former adversary, eliminated a long-standing threat. Yet the presence of large American military forces on both Iran's eastern and western borders created strategic anxiety. American troops were now stationed in Afghanistan and Iraq simultaneously. In 2003, according to U.S. officials and later reports, Iranian diplomats transmitted what became known as the Grand Bargain Proposal through Swiss intermediaries. The document allegedly suggested comprehensive talks covering Iran's nuclear program, support for militant groups, and normalization of relations. The Bush administration did not pursue the proposal, viewing Iran with continued suspicion. Meanwhile, violence in Iraq intensified. As insurgency grew after 2003, U.S. officials accused Iran of supporting Shia militias and supplying improvised explosive devices that targeted American troops. Tehran denied direct responsibility, but acknowledged ties to various Iraqi political factions. By 2004 and 2005, nuclear diplomacy shifted toward negotiations between Iran and European powers, Britain, France, and Germany, rather than direct U.S.-Iran talks. Iran temporarily suspended aspects of uranium enrichment under agreements reached in 2003 and 2004, but disputes over verification and long-term limits persisted. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president of Iran. His rhetoric toward Israel and the United States was confrontational, further hardening positions. The brief period after 9/11, when Iran and the United States found themselves opposing the same adversary in Afghanistan, faded into memory. The cooperation had been pragmatic and limited. It had not erased decades of mistrust. And when broader ideological and security conflicts resurfaced, nuclear concerns, regional influence, military presence, the narrow window of alignment closed. The years immediately following 9/11 revealed something complex in the U.S.-Iran relationship. They demonstrated that shared interests could exist. They also demonstrated how quickly political framing and strategic suspicion could override them. In late 2001, Iran and the United States had worked, quietly, toward stabilizing Afghanistan. By 2002, they were again publicly positioned as adversaries. The episode did not resolve hostility, but it exposed an underlying truth. The relationship was not defined solely by permanent enmity. Under certain conditions, limited cooperation was possible. Those conditions, however, proved fragile. And as the decade progressed, nuclear tensions would once again dominate the agenda. After the fall of Baghdad in 2003, Iran found itself in a transformed strategic environment. To the east, American forces were entrenched in Afghanistan. To the west, U.S. troops occupied Iraq. For the first time since the revolution, Iran was surrounded by a direct American military presence. At the same time, a separate issue began moving to the center of international attention: Iran's nuclear program. Iran's nuclear ambitions were not new. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in the 1970s, Iran had pursued civilian nuclear energy with Western assistance. After the 1979 revolution, much of that infrastructure stalled, but interest never disappeared. Iran remained a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, which it had ratified in 1970, granting it the right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes under international safeguards. The turning point came in August 2002, when an Iranian opposition group publicly revealed the existence of undeclared nuclear facilities at Natanz and Arak. The Natanz site was designed for uranium enrichment, while Arak included a heavy water production facility. The disclosures triggered inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. By 2003, IAEA reports confirmed that Iran had conducted enrichment-related activities without fully declaring them. While inspectors did not immediately prove an active nuclear weapons program, the concealment raised suspicions. For Washington, the timing was critical. The United States had just invaded Iraq under the justification that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. No such weapons were ultimately found. The Iraq experience sharpened scrutiny toward other states suspected of nuclear ambitions. In October 2003, under pressure from Britain, France, and Germany, often referred to as the EU3, Iran agreed to temporarily suspend uranium enrichment and signed the additional protocol to allow more intrusive inspections. The agreement was fragile. Iranian officials described the suspension as voluntary and temporary, not a permanent abandonment of enrichment. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad won Iran's presidential election. His administration took a firmer stance, arguing that enrichment was a sovereign right. In August 2005, Iran resumed uranium conversion activities at its Isfahan facility. By early 2006, enrichment at Natanz restarted. In response, the issue moved to the United Nations Security Council. Between 2006 and 2010, the Security Council passed multiple resolutions, including resolutions 1696, 1737, 1747, 1803, and 1929, demanding suspension of enrichment and imposing sanctions. These measures targeted individuals, financial institutions, and entities linked to Iran's nuclear and missile programs. The United States simultaneously expanded unilateral sanctions. The goal was to isolate Iran financially, restrict its access to global banking systems, and limit investment in its energy sector. Over time, sanctions affected oil exports, currency stability, and foreign reserves. Meanwhile, covert efforts emerged alongside diplomatic and economic pressure. In 2010, a sophisticated cyber weapon known as Stuxnet was discovered. Widely attributed to a joint U.S.-Israeli operation, Stuxnet targeted centrifuges at the Natanz facility, causing physical damage by subtly altering rotational speeds while reporting normal operations to monitoring systems. It marked one of the first publicly known uses of cyber warfare to sabotage industrial infrastructure. At the same time, between 2010 and 2012, several Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated in Tehran. Iranian officials blamed Israel and indirectly accused the United States of complicity. Washington denied involvement in the killings. Inside Iran, the nuclear program became a matter of national pride. Even critics of the government often supported the principle of enrichment as a sovereign right. The leadership framed resistance to international pressure as defense of independence. By 2011 and 2012, sanctions intensified significantly. The European Union imposed an oil embargo. The United States enacted measures restricting Iran's access to the SWIFT international financial messaging system. Iran's currency, the rial, depreciated sharply. Inflation rose. Oil exports dropped substantially. The economic strain was visible, yet the nuclear infrastructure continued expanding. By 2013, Iran had installed thousands of centrifuges at Natanz and had begun enrichment at the Fordo facility, built deep inside a mountain near Qom. Enrichment levels reached 20%, higher than needed for civilian power generation, but still below weapons grade, which typically requires enrichment above 90%. In June 2013, Hassan Rouhani, a cleric associated with pragmatic diplomacy, was elected president. Rouhani had previously served as Iran's chief nuclear negotiator in the early 2000s. His campaign emphasized economic recovery and sanctions relief. Secret bilateral talks between U.S. and Iranian officials began in Oman in 2013, laying groundwork for broader negotiations. Formal discussions between Iran and the P5+1, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and Germany intensified. On November 24, 2013, an interim agreement known as the Joint Plan of Action was reached. Iran agreed to limit enrichment activities and allow expanded inspections in exchange for partial sanctions relief. After nearly 2 years of negotiations, a comprehensive agreement was signed on July 14, 2015. Known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the deal placed strict limits on Iran's enrichment levels, reduced the number of operational centrifuges, redesigned the Arak heavy water reactor to prevent plutonium production, and established extensive monitoring by the IAEA. In exchange, nuclear-related sanctions were lifted or suspended. For supporters, the agreement reduced the risk of war and extended the time Iran would need to produce sufficient fissile material for a weapon. For critics, it left Iran's long-term nuclear capacity intact and failed to address ballistic missiles or regional activities. Throughout the 2000s and early 2000s, the nuclear issue had overshadowed nearly every other aspect of U.S.-Iran relations. It was not merely a technical dispute over centrifuges. It was a contest of trust. Washington doubted Iran's intentions, citing past concealment and hostile rhetoric. Tehran doubted American reliability, pointing to decades of sanctions and intervention. The nuclear shadow stretched over diplomacy, economics, and military planning. Military options were repeatedly discussed. Israeli leaders openly debated the possibility of preemptive strikes. U.S. officials maintained that all options were on the table. Yet no direct military confrontation occurred. Instead, the confrontation unfolded through sanctions, negotiations, cyber operations, and strategic signaling. By 2015, the shadow seemed to recede with the signing of the JCPOA. But the underlying distrust had not disappeared. The nuclear issue had become the central axis of the relationship, a symbol of technological capability, national sovereignty, and geopolitical rivalry. It would remain so in the years ahead. By 2013, more than a decade of escalating tension over Iran's nuclear program had produced a familiar cycle: expansion of enrichment, new sanctions, international condemnation, and stalled diplomacy. Iran's economy was under severe strain. Oil exports had dropped sharply under U.S. and European sanctions. The Iranian rial had lost significant value. Inflation surged. banking access was restricted. For ordinary Iranians, the economic impact was tangible. In June 2013, Hassan Rouhani was elected president of Iran. A cleric and longtime insider of the Islamic Republic, Rouhani campaigned on moderation and economic recovery. He argued that sanctions relief required serious negotiations. His election signaled that a significant portion of the Iranian electorate favored diplomatic engagement over continued isolation. Behind the scenes, quiet diplomatic channels had already opened. In 2012 and 2013, U.S. and Iranian officials met secretly in Oman, facilitated by Omani Sultan Qaboos bin Said. These bilateral discussions laid groundwork for broader multilateral talks. Formal negotiations took place between Iran and the P5+1, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and Germany. The talks were complex, technical, and politically sensitive. At the center was a fundamental dispute. Iran insisted on its right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. The United States and its partners sought to prevent Iran from developing the capacity to rapidly produce a nuclear weapon. On November 24, 2013, the parties reached an interim agreement known as the Joint Plan of Action. Iran agreed to cap enrichment at 5%, neutralize its stockpile of 20% enriched uranium, halt expansion at certain facilities, and allow more intrusive inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. In return, limited sanctions relief was provided. Over the next 18 months, negotiations intensified. Technical experts debated centrifuge numbers, enrichment levels, inspection regimes, and timelines for lifting sanctions. Diplomats met repeatedly in Geneva, Vienna, and Lausanne. On April 2, 2015, negotiators announced a framework agreement in Lausanne, Switzerland. The framework outlined core commitments. Iran would reduce its number of installed centrifuges from approximately 19,000 to about 6,100, with only 5,060 operating at its Natanz facility for a defined period. Enrichment levels would be capped at 3.67%. The underground Fordo facility would be converted into a research center without enrichment activity. The Arak heavy water reactor would be redesigned to prevent weapons-grade plutonium production. On July 14, 2015, after marathon negotiations in Vienna, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, was formally concluded. Under the JCPOA, Iran agreed to significant limitations for specified durations. Its stockpile of enriched uranium would be reduced by about 98%. Advanced centrifuge research would be restricted. The IAEA would implement continuous monitoring of key facilities, including surveillance cameras, access to uranium mines and mills, and inspection mechanisms designed to detect undeclared activities. In exchange, nuclear-related sanctions imposed by the United Nations, the European Union, and the United States were lifted or suspended once Iran verified compliance. Frozen Iranian assets abroad were gradually released. International oil and banking transactions resumed. The agreement was endorsed by United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231 on July 20, 2015. In Washington, President Barack Obama framed the deal as a diplomatic breakthrough that blocked Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon without resorting to war. He argued that inspections and verification mechanisms were robust and that the agreement extended the breakout time, the time required for Iran to produce enough fissile material for a bomb, to at least 1 year. In Tehran, President Rouhani presented the deal as a victory for diplomacy that preserved Iran's enrichment rights while relieving economic pressure. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei expressed cautious approval, emphasizing vigilance and distrust of U.S. intentions. The agreement faced strong opposition on multiple fronts. In the United States, critics in Congress argued that the deal did not dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure permanently, and that sunset clauses would allow enrichment limits to expire over time. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu strongly opposed the agreement, calling it a historic mistake. In Iran, hardliners accused negotiators of conceding too much to Western powers. Despite opposition, the JCPOA went into effect on January 16, 2016, known as Implementation Day, after the IAEA verified that Iran had met initial commitments. Sanctions relief began. Oil exports increased. International companies cautiously explored re-entry into the Iranian market. For the first time since the 1979 revolution, sustained direct negotiations between the United States and Iran had produced a formal agreement endorsed by both governments. Yet the deal did not resolve all tensions. It addressed the nuclear file specifically. It did not cover ballistic missile development, regional proxy conflicts, or broader political disputes. Mutual distrust remained embedded in public rhetoric and strategic calculations. Between 2016 and early 2018, the IAEA issued multiple reports confirming Iran's compliance with the agreement's technical requirements. The JCPOA represented a rare moment when decades of hostility gave way to structured diplomacy. It demonstrated that sustained negotiation was possible even after years of sanctions, covert sabotage, and military brinkmanship. But the durability of the agreement would soon be tested. The deal marked a pause in the nuclear confrontation. It did not erase the deeper mistrust that had accumulated over decades. And that unresolved mistrust would resurface with significant consequences. When the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action took effect in January 2016, it was presented by its architects as a long-term framework for preventing nuclear escalation. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, repeatedly certified that Iran was complying with the agreement's limits on enrichment levels, centrifuge numbers, and uranium stockpiles. Sanctions relief allowed Iran to increase oil exports and regain partial access to global financial systems. European companies cautiously explored investment opportunities. For a brief period, the nuclear file appeared contained. But in the United States, the deal remained politically divisive. During the 2016 presidential campaign, Donald Trump repeatedly criticized the JCPOA, calling it the worst deal ever negotiated. He argued that it failed to permanently dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure, did not address ballistic missile development, and did not curb Iran's regional activities in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. Critics within Congress and among U.S. allies such as Israel and Saudi Arabia shared these concerns. On January 20, 2017, Donald Trump took office as President of the United States. Although the administration initially continued to certify Iran's compliance, as required under U.S. law, internal debates intensified over whether to remain in the agreement. On October 13, 2017, President Trump announced that he would not certify the deal under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, though the United States did not immediately withdraw. He described the JCPOA as flawed and demanded changes, including addressing what he characterized as sunset clauses that would eventually allow certain restrictions to expire. Negotiations with European allies sought to modify or supplement the agreement, but no new framework was reached. On May 8, 2018, President Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the JCPOA. He signed a presidential memorandum directing the reimposition of all U.S. sanctions that had been lifted under the deal. The decision marked a significant shift in U.S. policy. Sanctions were reimposed in two phases, in August and November 2018. These measures targeted Iran's oil exports, banking sector, shipping, and energy infrastructure. The administration described the strategy as maximum pressure, intended to compel Iran to negotiate a broader agreement covering nuclear issues, missiles, and regional influence. The extraterritorial nature of U.S. sanctions once again affected non-American companies. Firms that continued doing business with Iran risked losing access to the U.S. financial system. Many European companies withdrew from the Iranian market to avoid penalties. Iranian oil exports fell sharply. The Iranian rial depreciated significantly. Inflation accelerated. Economic growth contracted. The economic strain deepened domestic challenges within Iran. The remaining parties to the JCPOA, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China, declared their intention to preserve the agreement. European governments attempted to create a financial mechanism known as INSTEX, Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges, to facilitate limited trade with Iran while bypassing U.S. sanctions. However, the mechanism had limited practical impact. For 1 year after the U.S. withdrawal, Iran continued to comply with most JCPOA provisions, urging European states to offset economic losses. When sanctions relief did not materialize at meaningful levels, Iran began gradually reducing its commitments. Beginning in May 2019, Iran incrementally breached specific limits established under the deal. It exceeded the 300-kilogram cap on low-enriched uranium stockpiles. It raised enrichment levels beyond the 3.67% threshold. It installed additional centrifuges and resumed certain activities at previously restricted facilities. Each step was framed by Iranian officials as reversible and proportionate to U.S. non-compliance. Meanwhile, tensions escalated in the Persian Gulf. In 2019, several oil tankers were damaged in incidents near the Strait of Hormuz. The United States attributed the attacks to Iran. Tehran denied responsibility. In June 2019, Iran shot down a U.S. surveillance drone, stating it had violated Iranian airspace. The United States stated the drone was operating in international airspace. President Trump authorized, then reportedly canceled, retaliatory military strikes. The maximum pressure campaign did not immediately produce new negotiations. Instead, it increased economic hardship in Iran and heightened regional instability. Supporters of withdrawal argued that the JCPOA had failed to restrain Iran's broader regional behavior and that economic pressure would force deeper concessions. Critics argued that withdrawal removed verifiable limits on Iran's nuclear program while isolating the United States from its European allies. By late 2019, the nuclear agreement remained formally intact among the remaining signatories, but was increasingly hollow. Enrichment levels rose, stockpiles expanded. The monitoring regime continued, but constraints loosened. The withdrawal fundamentally altered the trajectory of the nuclear dispute. What had been a structured agreement backed by international consensus became a fragmented arrangement marked by partial compliance and growing mistrust. For Iran, the U.S. exit reinforced long-standing suspicions about American reliability. Iranian leaders cited the withdrawal as evidence that agreements with Washington could be reversed by domestic political change. For the United States, the move signaled a willingness to abandon multilateral frameworks in favor of unilateral economic leverage. The withdrawal did not immediately lead to war, but it dismantled the central diplomatic structure that had managed the nuclear issue since 2015. And in the vacuum that followed, tensions would continue to rise, culminating in one of the most direct confrontations between the two countries in decades. By late 2019, tensions between the United States and Iran had reached a volatile level. The U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal in May 2018 and the reimposition of sweeping sanctions had severely strained Iran's economy. Iran had responded by gradually reducing its compliance with the JCPOA and by signaling that pressure would be met with counterpressure. Throughout 2019, incidents in the Persian Gulf intensified suspicion. In May and June, several oil tankers were damaged near the Strait of Hormuz. The United States attributed the attacks to Iran. Iran denied responsibility. On June 20, 2019, Iran shot down a US RQ-4A Global Hawk surveillance drone. Tehran stated the drone had violated Iranian airspace. Washington insisted it had been flying over international waters. President Donald Trump reportedly approved retaliatory strikes and then canceled them shortly before execution. But the most dramatic escalation came at the very start of 2020. On December 27, 2019, more than 30 rockets were fired at the K-1 military base near Kirkuk, Iraq, killing an American civilian contractor and wounding U.S. and Iraqi personnel. The United States blamed Kataib Hezbollah, an Iraqi Shia militia aligned with Iran and integrated into Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces. On December 29th, the United States carried out airstrikes on Kataib Hezbollah positions in Iraq and Syria, killing at least 25 fighters. The strikes sparked outrage among militia supporters. On December 31st, demonstrators, including militia members, surrounded and breached parts of the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad. The embassy was not overrun, but images of fires and crowds at the compound drew immediate comparisons to earlier crises in U.S.-Iran relations. In Washington, senior officials argued that deterrence required a stronger response. In the early hours of January 3, 2020, a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone fired missiles at a convoy leaving Baghdad International Airport. Among those killed was Major General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Quds Force. Soleimani was one of the most powerful military figures in Iran. As head of the Quds Force, he oversaw Iran's extraterritorial operations, building networks of allied militias and political actors in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond. Within Iran, he was widely regarded as a national hero for his role in coordinating efforts against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Also killed in the strike was Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, deputy commander of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces and leader of Kataib Hezbollah. The strike was conducted without prior consultation with the Iraqi government, and it immediately triggered global reaction. The Trump administration stated that Soleimani had been planning imminent attacks against American personnel and that the strike was an act of self-defense. Critics questioned the evidence for imminence and warned that targeting a senior Iranian official risked open war. In Iran, the reaction was swift and intense. Millions participated in funeral processions across multiple cities, including Tehran, Mashhad, and Qom. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei declared that severe revenge would follow. For several days, the region stood on edge. On January 8, 2020, Iran launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi bases hosting U.S. forces, Al-Assad Air Base and a facility in Erbil. No American service members were killed in the strikes, though more than 100 were later diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries. Iran described the missile barrage as a proportional response. The United States did not respond with additional military strikes. President Trump announced new sanctions, but signaled that no further military escalation was planned. However, that same morning, another tragedy occurred. On January 8, 2020, Shortly after takeoff from Tehran's Imam Khomeini International Airport, Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 was shot down by Iranian air defenses. All 176 people on board were killed. Initially, Iranian authorities denied responsibility. Days later, Iran acknowledged that its forces had mistakenly fired on the aircraft, citing heightened alert status following the missile strikes against U.S. bases. The sequence of events underscored how close the confrontation had come to spiraling beyond control. The killing of Qasem Soleimani marked the first time the United States had directly targeted and killed a senior Iranian state official. It crossed a threshold that had long been avoided in U.S.-Iran tensions. For decades, confrontation had occurred through proxies, sanctions, and indirect clashes. This was a direct strike on a central figure of the Iranian security establishment. The long-term consequences were complex. In Iraq, the parliament passed a non-binding resolution calling for the removal of foreign troops. Iran signaled it would continue regional activities. The United States maintained its sanctions policy. The immediate crisis did not expand into full-scale war, but the strike reshaped deterrence calculations on both sides. For Iran, the event reinforced the belief that the United States was willing to use direct force at the highest levels. For the United States, it demonstrated a readiness to escalate beyond proxy confrontation. The drone strike did not begin the hostility between Washington and Tehran, but it marked one of the most direct and dangerous moments in their modern history. A moment when decades of mistrust, sanctions, and shadow conflict converged in a single flash over Baghdad's airport. And for several days in January 2020, the possibility of open war no longer seemed theoretical. After January 2020, the United States and Iran did not enter open war, but neither did they return to stability. Instead, the confrontation evolved into something quieter, more dispersed, and more difficult to contain. A sustained shadow conflict unfolding across multiple arenas: Iraq, Syria, the Persian Gulf, cyberspace, and the nuclear file. Following the killing of Qasem Soleimani and Iran's missile retaliation on U.S. bases in Iraq, both sides appeared to pause. Public rhetoric remained sharp, but direct military exchange subsided. Yet beneath the surface, patterns of indirect confrontation intensified. In Iraq, Iran-aligned militias continued operating within the framework of the Popular Mobilization Forces. Rocket and drone attacks targeting facilities housing U.S. personnel occurred intermittently throughout 2020 and 2021. The United States responded with occasional airstrikes against militia infrastructure, particularly along the Iraq-Syria border. These exchanges rarely escalated beyond limited strikes, but they kept tensions active. Meanwhile, the nuclear issue returned to center stage. After the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 and the imposition of maximum pressure sanctions, Iran gradually expanded its nuclear activities. By 2020 and 2021, enrichment levels had reached 20% and later 60%, significantly above the 3.67% cap. Established under the 2015 agreement, though still below weapons grade. Advanced centrifuges were installed at Natanz and Fordow. The stockpile of enriched uranium grew. The International Atomic Energy Agency continued inspections, but reported reduced access after Iran curtailed certain monitoring measures in 2021 in response to sanctions. Negotiations to revive the nuclear deal resumed in Vienna in 2021 after President Joe Biden took office in January of that year. The Biden administration expressed willingness to return to compliance if Iran did the same. Indirect talks began between U.S. and Iranian negotiators through European intermediaries. progress was uneven. Disputes centered on sequencing of sanctions relief, guarantees against future U.S. withdrawal, and verification mechanisms. As diplomacy stalled intermittently, covert activity persisted. In April 2021, an explosion at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility damaged centrifuges. Iranian officials blamed Israel. Similar sabotage incidents had occurred in previous years, including the 2020 assassination of nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh near Tehran. Though the United States did not publicly claim involvement in these actions, the broader context of coordination between Washington and Israel against Iranian nuclear expansion remained part of strategic calculations. At sea, the shadow war extended into maritime space. Since 2019, Israeli-owned or Iran-linked vessels were reportedly targeted in the Red Sea and Arabian Sea through mines and drone attacks. Both sides accused the other of orchestrating covert maritime strikes. The Persian Gulf, long a site of tension, remained heavily militarized. Cyber operations became another arena of confrontation. U.S. agencies accused Iran of targeting American infrastructure and private companies with cyber intrusions. Iran, in turn, accused the United States and Israel of conducting cyber attacks against its industrial facilities. Regionally, Iran continued supporting allied actors in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. In Syria, Iranian forces and affiliated militias maintained positions supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad. Israel conducted periodic airstrikes against Iranian-linked targets in Syria, seeking to limit Tehran's military entrenchment. The United States maintained a limited troop presence in northeastern Syria and western Iraq, officially focused on countering remnants of the Islamic State. In Yemen, the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Houthi forces, whom Riyadh and Washington accused Iran of backing, remained another front of indirect rivalry. Though Tehran denied direct military control over the Houthis, it acknowledged political support. Sanctions remained a central instrument of U.S. policy. Even as diplomatic efforts fluctuated, financial restrictions and trade barriers stayed largely in place. Iranian oil exports adapted through alternative channels, including sales to China, but economic pressure persisted. Inflation, currency instability, and restricted access to global finance continued shaping Iran's domestic environment. Inside Iran, political shifts also influenced the trajectory of relations. In June 2021, Ebrahim Raisi was elected president, succeeding Hassan Rouhani. Raisi, seen as closer to conservative factions, took a firmer tone in negotiations. While talks over the nuclear file continued intermittently, trust deficits deepened. The relationship between the two countries became defined by calibrated hostility. Neither side sought direct, full-scale war. Both understood the costs. Yet neither side fundamentally trusted the other's intentions. Each action, whether a drone strike, a sanctions announcement, an enrichment expansion, or a militia attack, was interpreted through decades of accumulated suspicion. The pattern that emerged after 2020 was not one of dramatic confrontation like 1979 or 1988. It was sustained friction, limited strikes, indirect engagement, covert sabotage, negotiations that advanced and stalled, sanctions that tightened and adapted. The shadow war was not declared formally. It unfolded through layers of ambiguity, where responsibility was often implied rather than claimed outright. And beneath all of it remained the same unresolved core issues that had defined the relationship for decades: sovereignty, security, regional influence, nuclear capability, and trust, or the absence of it. By the early 2000s, more than 40 years after the revolution, the United States and Iran remained locked in a relationship that was neither open war nor genuine peace. It was a state of managed hostility, shaped by memory and strategy alike. The conflict had evolved from embassies and battlefields into sanctions regimes, cyber networks, missile deterrents, and proxy arenas. The shadow war continues not because of a single event, but because of accumulated history, each chapter layering over the previous one, each grievance reinforcing the next. And until one side fundamentally redefines the framework of engagement, the tension is likely to persist, sometimes visible, often hidden, but always present. In late February 2026, a major military escalation erupted in the Middle East when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of air and missile strikes on Iranian territory. The operation, described by Washington as Operation Epic Fury, targeted numerous Iranian military and strategic sites, including missile installations, command centers, and other infrastructure. According to U.S. military statements, the strikes were intended to degrade Iran's ability to project force and to weaken the leadership structures of the Islamic Republic. State media in Iran reported explosions in Tehran and across several other provinces, leading to hundreds of deaths and injuries among both military personnel and civilians. In one of the most tragic incidents, a primary school in Minab, southern Iran, was hit during the operation, killing at least 148 people, most of them school children, according to Iranian authorities. Several senior Iranian security officials were also reportedly killed in the strikes. Independent reporting indicates that 7 high-ranking commanders, including advisors linked to Iran's security apparatus, were among those killed in targeted strikes in Tehran. Perhaps the most consequential claim from U.S. political leadership was the reported death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, early in the offensive, a development publicly announced by U.S. leadership and widely broadcast in international media. The Iranian government confirmed heavy damage to high-level security sites, though Iranian officials initially made ambiguous statements regarding Khamenei's status amid the chaos. Iran reacted swiftly. Within hours of the U.S.-Israeli attacks, Iranian forces launched retaliatory missile strikes targeting both Israeli and U.S. military bases across the region. Sirens were reported in parts of Israel, civil defense measures were activated, and the Israeli government declared a widespread state of emergency, closing schools and banning large public gatherings as a precaution. The involvement of Iran-aligned militias, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, expanded the conflict further. Hezbollah reportedly launched missile and drone attacks from Lebanese territory into Israel, prompting Israeli airstrikes against Hezbollah-held areas in southern Beirut and other parts of Lebanon. At least 30 people were killed and dozens injured in those exchanges. The violence has spread beyond Israel and Iran. Missile attacks were reported against U.S. interests and bases in Iraq and Kuwait. A drone strike reportedly hit a British airbase in Cyprus. Gulf states such as the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia have experienced related explosions or attacks amid the broader escalation. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session in response, with Secretary General Antonio Guterres warning that the attacks by all sides violate international law and emphasizing the urgent need to prevent wider regional war. Some UN members, including Russia and China, urged an immediate halt to hostilities and a return to diplomacy. This latest round of violence marks one of the most direct and intense confrontations between Iran and a U.S.-Israel coalition in decades. It represents a dramatic escalation from the proxy and shadow clashes that have defined much of the post-1979 era. Global energy markets, travel routes, and regional geopolitics were immediately affected, and calls for restraint from multiple international actors underscore the risk of broader conflict.